In this video, I'm going to show you how to take a boring render like this and turn it into a full-on snowstorm, like you can see here. So this is straight out of Blender, but if you throw a color grade on this, you can get some really nice stuff in After Effects. This video is just going to cover the stuff in Blender, but that's the final look that I posted on Instagram, that there. But let me show you how to get to this stage right here, which is everything that I'm going to cover here is all pretty simple stuff, but it's combining like 4 or 5 different techniques together to create kind of this complete snowstorm look. So we're going to go over volumetrics and wind gusts and particles and snowflakes and camera shake, and it's all pretty easy stuff and it's all free. And yeah, let's go. So the first one is just standard volumetrics. I've talked about this a lot before on this channel, but I'll just quickly show you again if you haven't seen this. So I'm just going to add a cube in here. So Shift A, cube, scale this up kind of like over the area that you would want to see this. The area that I want to have it at is not actually the entire scene. I actually kind of want to have it in a specific part of the scene, which I'll show you. So something like that. And you'll notice that I actually didn't extend this all the way up here. I'll show you why. So first of all, let me add a new texture to this. So in here, let me hide this and just show you what it's looking like. So here's the before any volume, and right now it's dark, but if I add a new texture, delete this, and then Shift A, just add a volume scatter and plug that right into the volume. It's going to do kind of nothing, but if you scroll in and out on the viewport, that will refresh it and it will actually update to the proper density. So this is actually way too thick right now. I'll just lower this to like 0.01 or something. I like to have the anisotropy turned up quite a lot. For some reason, it just kind of feels a bit more natural when I turn this up and it looks cool. Something like that is going to be fine. That's kind of like the base layer of this to set the mood for everything else afterwards. The reason I didn't have this extend all the way up here and like cover the entire scene or the entire world is because it just looks weird. Like when you have it extending all the way up, sometimes it just doesn't feel right, and it seems kind of wrong to have this ceiling of this volume like pulled way down like this. But for some reason, like you can't actually really tell from the camera perspective of like being inside this cube of volume. There is another volume layer or thing that I want to add after this to kind of help make it look like there's wind gusts kind of blowing around here. Let me first of all display this cube as bounds. Let's get it out of the way because it's really annoying. So if you just click on that volume cube, go to this orange square tab and then go down to viewport display, go down to viewport display, choose this display as menu, and then switch it to bounds. Then it would just be a wireframe cube and it will just be out of the way. So I'm going to add another cube. This one can be a little bit smaller. I don't need it to extend that far out. And this one doesn't need to go like sideways out here too much either. Like it doesn't matter. But anyways, this one will just be a little bit smaller. And what I'm going to do with this one is same thing. New texture, delete this, add a volume scatter, plug it to the volume. And this time I want the density to be controlled by a noise texture. And that noise texture is going to get animated from left to right. So this is the second thing that kind of helps sell this effect. So let me just show you this. I'll take a noise texture and I'm going to run that into the density. Again, it's going to be just kind of overkill at first. So let me add a color ramp. And what this means is that I can now control exactly which parts of this are visible and which parts are not. So this noise is getting really, really increased contrast. That really increased contrast, 3-dimensional noise, is getting, that's what's controlling the density of this volume here. I'm going to hit Control T with that noise texture selected. That gives us 2 extra nodes, a texture coordinate and a mapping. You've probably seen these before. And what I'm going to do is just take this X location here. So you can see if I move this, it's just going to slide that noise texture along whichever axis you move it along. So if I move it on the Y, it's going to do this, and X is going to do that. So I want to have it kind of coming in from the left or from the right, moving to the left. So what I'll do is just go to the beginning of my animation. Here I'm actually in the graph editor, so it's kind of like the timeline, but it means you actually can move around the keyframes a bit easier. So it's good to get familiar with this if you've never used it, but I'll show you this in a second. Anyways, so mapping node, I'm going to keyframe the X location. So I want it to start at one point and I want it to end at another point. So here's how you do that. So just hover over this, press I on the keyboard, just press I for insert keyframe, or right click it and insert keyframe here. I'm going to go to the end of the animation and then just slide this along to somewhere like there. Doesn't really matter. Press I again, and we have 2 keyframes now. So if I come here, you can see as this plays along, this is just going to move from right to left. And that's exactly what I want. Not this speed though. So let me just speed this up. And this is what's nice about the graph editor is you can just grab these keyframes, and it's the same controls as like you would use in the viewport. So that means I can just grab this keyframe and just move it up on the y-axis. So I'm just grabbing it, pressing G, Y, just like you would do in the viewport. And I want to like increase the slope of this curve. So I'll just bring it up here and let's just see what that looks like. And so something like that, maybe a little bit slower, is going to be fine. Now this is way too strong, but I'm just leaving it way too much so you can actually see what it's doing for now. I'm going to lower it in a second. But that's the effect. And the key here is to keep it as subtle as possible, to the point where you barely even notice it. And it will just help give that extra little touch of making it look like there's like patches of snow or like fog kind of going by. Okay, so to lower the effect of this, you can use the map range here and lower this, but you can actually do the same thing in a color ramp. So I'll just do this here. If you just select the white handle on the color ramp that's going into the density, just click that, and then the value here, if you just lower that to like 0.1 or 0. I think I had it like 0.05 in mine, the maximum density will be reduced way down. So it's kind of like basically like using a map range, but just inside the color ramp. So now that, when layered with the volume and then the next effect, which is going to be actually adding snowflakes on top of this, that will really help just make it look like there's a big snowstorm here. Let me move on actually now to the actual snow, like the actual particles that are going to get emitted here. And the way you do that is just a regular emitter particle system. You've probably used them before. You've probably seen it before. If not, I'll just quickly run you through it. I'm not going to go super in depth into this, but I'll show you the main things that are important to watch out for here. I'm going to hide those 2 original volumes that I just made there. So for this particle system, here's how I'm going to do it. I'm going to add another cube. I know everything's a cube, but just bear with me. So that is going to go... So again, the camera is right here. I just want you to see where this actually is so you can get an idea of why I'm putting things over here. So the camera's here. It's looking this way. And I want to have the snow kind of starting on the right side and then getting blown in from that side over to the left past the camera and just kind of whizzing past like that. So here's how I'm going to do that. I want to set up, this is going to be, this object right here that I'm adding is going to be the emitter object. So this is going to be the thing that emits all the snow particles out of it. And then we're going to use some force fields and some other stuff to like make it actually go from right to left. For now though, I'm basically just picking the starting point of these particles, right? So I don't want to be able to see this in the render. So I'm just going to make sure that that is kind of off camera. Okay, so now to make this a particle system, you can actually click on any object and there's this tab right here called particles. And you can just hit the plus, and by default, it will be on this emitter one here. So an emitter particle system just does this right here. If I just hit play, it just, okay, so there are other force fields in my scene that I forgot about from when I actually made this render. So what I'm going to do is, to make it look like what yours would look like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to add, I'm just going to add any random object, move it to a collection, and just call it test. You don't have to do this. I'm just doing this because otherwise the way I've set up this system from when I actually made this render is going to affect the tutorial. So I'm just going to undo that by making this only affected by this test collection. Okay. So now, yours should look like this. When you add that, when you hit the plus here and you have a new particle system, an emitter particle system will just do this right here. It'll just kind of spray out these little bits kind of randomly. So yeah, you can see how we can work with this to make it look like a lot of different things. In this case, snow. And here's how you do it. Okay, so there's a few problems here, right? So they're spawning, they're getting affected by gravity, they're dropping straight down, and then they're disappearing. The way to like make it not do any of that is, first of all, disable gravity. So in that field weights section I was just in, I'm going to take gravity to 0. And then I want the lifetime to be increased so I don't actually need the lifetime to be like 1,000 or anything. I can keep it pretty low because it won't be visible for that long. And then once it's out of the camera view, I don't need it to exist anymore. Okay, so I'll keep that there. my animation is 350 frames long, so I actually want this to end on frame 350, but I don't want it to start on frame 1 because that's when my animation is fully, like that's when the animation starts. It's when you start seeing things. So if this starts on frame 1, it means you actually, since it's off camera, you won't see these until they reach when it enters the camera view, which is going to take a few frames. So I'm going to set that the frame start, instead of being on 1, you can actually start it before your animation starts. So I'll set it to like negative, I don't know, 150, negative 200 maybe. I could probably do negative 150. Right now there's no wind, but once there is wind, I think that will be a good amount right there. Okay, so that might not have seemed important right now, but you'll see how this works once you set it up yourself and once you see when I do it. Okay, to make it actually get affected by wind and like add randomness, here's how you do that. I'm going to add a force field, and I'm just going to choose wind. So when you add a force field, say a wind force field, by default, it will just work for you. But since I'm only having this affected by that test collection, you can see my effector collection here is set to that test one I made earlier. I'm just doing that because, again, there's other force fields in my scene that are affecting different things from the thing I made earlier. So I'm going to move this force field to that test collection. You probably don't have to do that. You can just leave it in your scene, and by default, it should work. Okay. But that is another thing. If you want to have like different force fields affecting different things, you can move them to different collections and then pick them from here. Anyways, with that wind in there, if I set the strength to, I don't know, let's do like 100. There we go. It's now windy. So the way this works, it might seem weird if you've never used this before. Like, how is this random object affecting this other random object? Well, the way it works is when you add a force field in your scene, it just kind of affects all of the emitter particle systems that you have in there, and even hair particle systems. Okay, so I think 100 is too much. Let's do like 80. And let's just look at it from the camera view. So that's kind of the speed that I want. I might actually go 100. Let me increase the number though. So 1,000 is going to be the amount of particles. If you think about in a snowstorm, over the course of 10 seconds or however long this is, you would probably see more than 1,000 snowflakes. So I'm going to set this to like, I don't know, 25,000. Let's try that. And let's just see what it looks like. So if I go to the beginning of my animation by hitting Shift and then the left arrow key. So that's kind of doing what I want. 100 might be a bit much for this. I might actually lower this to, well, I'll see. Once I add the turbulence, we'll see. So that's the next thing I'm going to do is another force field. And this time I'm going to pick turbulence. And I'm going to move that also to my test collection. Okay, so what turbulence does is it's kind of like adding random noise to the particles, to the movement of them. So by default, this strength is going to be too low because it's so windy. So I'm actually going to set this to like 80 or something too. Yeah, let's go to test turbulence. I'm going to increase the flow. I had this on 1 for my final render, and it looked pretty good, so I'm just going to do that again. Okay, I think the wind is a little too strong. I'm going to decrease that to, okay, I think that's going to be a good amount right there. So I think the lifetime might be a little bit low. So on here, I'll just do lifetime. Let's increase it to 150. And I just kind of want an even distribution of particles across my whole scene. Okay, to make a snowflake, let's just add a plane. And I can maybe even just do nothing to it, and we'll see if that works. So I'm just going to name this. Let's name it Snowflake. I guess I have to call it Snowflake 2. In the particles tab here, choose render and then render as object. So I want it to be rendering as an object, and then for the object, I'm just going to search for snowflake, and I'll just pick Snowflake 2, the one I just made. Cool. And it's very small, so I'm just going to increase the scale. And let's also check this rotation checkbox because you can see that they're all like facing the same way. So I want rotation, and I want it to be dynamic, and I want it to be randomized phase and randomize everything here. Okay, so let's go back to the beginning and let's just see what that looks like. Cool. So that is kind of the right movement that I'm looking for, right? Kind of like randomness, going from left to right. It might be too much left to right, so I might take the wind and actually angle it down a little bit more, like you would kind of expect snow to be falling in. So let's try that. and maybe a little bit more this way. Something like that. Doesn't really matter. Can always dial this in later, but for now I just want to get the look kind of right. Okay, so that's pretty good for now. And what's nice about the turbulence is it really adds a lot of randomness, and it just makes it look like the wind is kind of just going all over the place. And I really, really like that effect. Okay, so I probably honestly could just leave this as planes, to be like rendering as just regular planes and do nothing to them, because there's going to be motion blur in here, and these are moving fast enough that I think that it'll just be fully blurred out, and you won't actually see, like, you're not going to see individual snowflakes up close or anything. So it's probably fine. In my original render, I set the texture to be like a snowflake texture, which I don't think you need to do that. The key here is you're probably going to have to do some test renders along the way here to get the exact look that you want, because you can't really tell in the viewport without motion blur. Speaking of motion blur, if you go to the camera settings, or the render settings rather, right here, just come down to motion blur, check this box, and then I actually left it on pretty close to the default right here. So you could probably just check this box and it would look fine. Let me do a test render and just see what this actually looks like, because I don't know. Okay, so here's the test render that I just did with all that stuff I just showed you. There's a few things here. So I think the texture for the snowflakes, or texture, it's a default plane, looks pretty good. I would honestly say you could just leave it at that if you wanted to, and it would look fine. As long as it's a white thing blowing past, it's fine. The original volume that I set up, the one with the one that's moving, is a little bit too much. So you can see it kind of looks like smog a little bit. I'm gonna lower that. And the other thing too is I would need to do a test of an animated version of this, because you can't really tell what it looks like moving unless you see it moving. You can kind of guess with rendering a frame and looking at the motion blur, but you can't really see what it actually looks like. So to get the exact settings right for this, the volume that's kind of moving from right to left, and the speed of the snow and all that, I would just recommend setting the resolution and samples to both like 50% of what you were going to do for the final. That will speed it up a lot, and just do like a really low quality test render just to get an idea of how things are moving around. Okay, so to lower this this moving fog thing right here, let me just first of all increase the anisotropy to like a little bit higher, just because in my final one I had a little bit higher too. And then I'll decrease the density. Let's lower this to like, instead of 0.05, let's do like 0.03. You won't really see this in the viewport, but in the final render, because it's just a mess of like denoising in here, you can't really tell what's going on, but in the final render it should look nice. One tip I forgot to mention is for the volume to kind of work properly, you want to have at least a couple of volume bounces. You can see that if I have underneath the light path settings, if I have the volume max bounces set to 0, it makes it really dark and kind of looks just like polluted and smoggy. If you have this set to like 1 or 2, it just lightens up the volume. It lets light kind of bounce around through it a little bit nicer, and just makes it a bit more snow looking. I think that's everything for these settings right here. I just want to mention with this particle system too, there's a lot that I would go in here and tweak and just refine. The things you would be messing with is probably number 1, the number of particles. Number 2, the speed of the wind and turbulence. And that's probably it. Maybe the scale and scale randomness as well. So you'll just have to kind of mess around with those numbers, and it's going to be probably different for every scene and what makes sense for that environment. So once you have these settings kind of dialed to what you want, don't forget to bake it. So the way you do that is just open up this cache tab right here. And mine's already baked, but I'll delete it. Open up this cache tab and just click bake, and that will just kind of lock it into place. If you don't do that, when you do the final render, there's like a decent chance that it'll be fully messed up and just won't work at all. If you bake it, you don't have to worry about that. It'll just work perfectly. It'll work perfectly for the final render. The only thing is when you do that, basically it just kind of temporarily freezes it in place, and you can't tweak these settings unless you delete the bake, adjust it, and then rebake it. So I think that's it for these settings here. There's one more thing though that isn't actually snow related that does help sell this effect. It's not necessary, but it can look really nice in combination with these things that I've showed you here. And that is adding camera shake. So on my camera, I don't think I have this. I do. Okay. So what this is, the way I do camera shake is very simple. I just use Ian Hubert's add-on. It's called Camera Shakeify. You can see it right here. You can just search this on Google and you will find it. It's free. And this add-on is extremely handy because it means instead of like manually animating camera shake and like adding noise modifiers to like the X rotation of the camera, you can just click this button right here. I'll just hit the plus. And there's all these presets of like different types of camera shake. I think the one I picked was walk to the store. And if I press play now, you can see it just adds camera shake. Let me display this cube as bounds to get it out of the way. So it just automatically adds camera shake, which is super handy. So here's the before, just perfectly smooth. But I want it to look like it's somebody holding a camera walking through a snowstorm. So I want to turn this influence up. And this would be like full, right? It's a bit intense. I think for mine, I had it at 0.25. So if you just turn the influence down to a quarter, that is actually still a decently high number. You'll really notice that in the render. But I'd like to have it pretty high for, like this would be a high number, higher than I would normally use. But I'd like to have it high for something like this that's literally in a snowstorm, right? So I think that's fine to use there. Like I said before, if you do a low quality test render, like just lower the samples way down to like 50 samples or something, lower the resolution to 50% or even 25% of what you would do in the final, and then just look at what it looks like with all this stuff, and then tweak it accordingly and fix it and make it look like however you want for your specific scene, you'll end up with a very similar result to this. If you just test it out and mess around with these settings and kind of adjust it for what you need. So again, here's the final look straight out of Blender. Here is the final look with After Effects, like with my post-processing stuff I did in After Effects. I'm not going to show you exactly what I did there, but in my last video, I showed the After Effects workflow that I'm doing right now for animations. I used pretty much all the same techniques as I did in that one, so you can just go watch that if you want to see how I did that. But yeah, after color grade does look much nicer. But this one was just focusing on how to set up all these systems in Blender. Anyways, hope that was useful. If it was, I don't know, share it with somebody, and take care.